And at the end, something awkward is you just keep looking at me for an extra like 10 seconds. So
Okay.
I say thank you, but we just look at each other.
Okay.
It gets cut in editing, but
if you hear a cut from me, you're good to go.
Yeah.
10 seconds might be.
Oh, is that too long? Okay.
I mean, as a joke, it'd be really fun.
Just keep it rolling. Yeah, right.
Never mind. Don't listen to me, Ryan. Just listen. Welcome to Guide to the Global Economy. On today's episode, we're going to look at South Korea's investments in Africa. We're also going to take a deep dive into Mongolia to understand the different political and economic forces that are weighing on them. But first, I want to turn to Sophia Bush, Program Assistant here at the Geoeconomics Center, for our lead. Sophia, there was a lot of talk last week about Turkey and the EU, and that got us thinking we wanted to do a European economic story.
Yeah, so we wanted to know what would it look like if Turkey joined the EU in the near term, which we'll see. But yeah, so we wanted to look and see how that could impact the EU's GDP growth, and we looked at 2023.
So let's take a look at the numbers. Well, there
yeah.
you go. Pretty stark. Seems that Turkey would be a major contributor to EU GDP growth. Walk us through the methodology here.
Yeah, so it certainly would be. It would be the second largest contributor to EU GDP growth.
Wow, so out of the EU 27, Turkey would be number 2. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so then what we did to kind of figure this out is we took the 2022 GDP data from the World Bank, and then we multiplied that by Bloomberg's projections. So that got us to see not only each country's GDP growth, but to see that weighted by its size so that we could get a sense of the contribution.
And it's important to note, we're not talking about largest economies in
Right.
Europe. Of course, Germany is and will remain the largest economy in Europe, and France is a huge economy in Europe. It's about GDP growth, how these countries are growing year on year.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're looking at the map here, the hotter colors show, faster growth, a larger contribution to EU GDP. And then the cooler colors denote a slowdown.
That makes sense. So it seems like there's a bit of a trend here. Turkey would be second largest contributor to EU GDP growth. And what would be the largest contributor?
Spain would.
Spain would be the largest
Yes,
contributor to
yeah.
EU GDP growth in 2023.
2023.
And Spain will be, I assume, based on the current trends.
Yeah, based on current trends.
And then Italy seems to be a major contributor as well.
Yeah, so we're seeing this trend where it's the southern European countries that are driving this growth.
That jumps out clearly when you look at this. I mean, you see Spain and Italy and Turkey, not an EU member, but makes the point. But it's around the Mediterranean where it seems like there's really a hot zone of growth here.
Yeah, and then obviously you can see it starts to get a little bit colder. We're slowing down a bit once you get up towards Central and Eastern Europe.
Well, what's going on with Germany? I mean, Germany jumps out on the map here. You see it in the icy blue, a negative contributor to EU GDP growth based on the projections and the calculations you and the team did.
Right, and I think it's worth saying that the projections we looked at are slightly different from official forecasts.
Yeah.
But that said, Germany's been, it's one of the countries that's been the most dependent on Russian gas. That's been a factor. And then, it could be facing a cyclical recession as well in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the Russia situation, energy reliance impacting Germany more than other European countries. And then there's the China factor too. Germany's economic strategy, heavily reliant on Russia, also deeply interconnected with China, especially when it comes to vehicles. China now doing a lot more of their own vehicle production, so that's driving down. But it just jumps out at the map. What's so interesting to me is I worked on these issues within the US government during the Eurozone crisis, 2010, 2011. It's the flip of where we were a decade ago, meaning it was Greece and southern European countries, but Greece in particular, that was creating huge economic issues across the continent. It's a different story right now when you look at Europe.
Yeah, and I think it is worth saying that it's a different story right now, but historically, the map would have looked a little bit more like this.
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, yeah, I'm just thinking the last decade, but walk us back even further.
Yeah, so up until the mid-1990s, Southern Europe was converging with Northern Europe, and that's a broad generalization. But we had countries like Portugal,
Yeah.
joining the EU and
Growing fast while they were
Right.
doing it.
yeah, post-succession is a
Yeah.
really important time for growth, and that's what we've seen.
So the 2010s were actually more an aberration to the historical norm. So the question going forward is something 23 specific, something Germany specific we're looking at here, or is this something long term?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the question that I'll be thinking about in the next year, because it is unclear, but there are these secular trends that are, ongoing, especially in Germany. What you talked about with the auto industry, their industrial model, their export model. We'll see if this is what the map's going to look like in the next decade, or if this is just the next couple of years, possibly.
Well, we'll keep tracking it here at the center because it's not just about economics. If the economics shift, then the politics within Europe shift
Right.
and the balance of power shifts a little bit as well. So hugely important for the future of Europe. Sophia, thanks so much for looking into it for us.
Of course.
For Under the Radar today, we wanted to take a look at Mongolia and understand the competing political and economic pressures that were coming to bear on the country in recent weeks. I want to turn to Ryan Murphy, young global professional here with us at the Geoeconomics Center. Ryan, what did you find?
So Mongolia is very interesting. For the longest time, since the 1990s, it's had a policy of a third neighbor. And that's a term coined by U.S. Secretary of State James A. Baker.
Oh, I didn't know Secretary Baker coined that term. Oh, that's interesting.
Yes,
Okay, so this is the third neighbor policy.
It is. So it's right after Mongolia had democratic elections and was partnering with the U.S. And what this means is that Mongolia, sandwiched between Russia to the north and China to the south, has a policy of cooperating with other neighbors, other countries abroad, so U.S., Australia.
Using the term neighbor loosely.
Using the term very loosely.
Yeah.
And so what we see very recently is a flurry of activity surrounding this. So very recently, we had Poland visit, a Polish delegation visit for copper, securing copper. We had a French delegation, Emmanuel Macron actually being the very first French president to set foot on Mongolian soil.
Really? That's interesting.
Pursuing uranium, and then just in July, we've had the Emiratis pursue grain deals with the country.
Oh, so it's been busy in Mongolia, a lot of visits.
It's been quite.
But there was a specific issue with the U.S. visit, you noted.
Yes. So actually, in late June, June 27th, a U.S. delegation came to Mongolia to sign a memorandum of understanding with cooperation on critical minerals. And this was also with Korea as a third partner. However, the very same day, the Prime Minister of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, was down in Beijing visiting with Xi Jinping.
Huh. So U.S. delegation comes, critical MOU, Prime Ministers in China.
Exactly.
Probably noticed by the U.S. delegation.
Very much noticed, and later the Prime Minister attended the World Economic Forum, or Summer Davos, hosted by the Chinese.
So what's going on strategically, do you think, from Mongolia's perspective?
From Mongolia's perspective, they're trying to balance many differing requests. And so they're balancing much of this friendshoring pressure, securing critical minerals, especially after China's export restrictions on gallium and germanium, but also keeping consistent with their neighbors. Right. So 95% of Mongolian trade still goes to China. And so they're looking to maintain these cooperative arrangements, most recently the Mongolia-China-Russia economic corridor. And so while there are new neighbors on the block, as it were to seem, the existing neighbors might be held just a bit closer.
Yeah, and especially when the existing neighbors are Russia and China, it's not so easy to just add in a whole range of other countries, including the U.S. But clearly, as you say, Mongolia is going to try to do both at the same time, and we'll keep a close eye on how they do that and proceed. Ryan, thanks so much for looking into it for us.
Thank you, Josh.
For By the Numbers this week, we wanted to look at Asia's investments into Africa, and I want to bring in Mondrita Rashid, young global professional with us at the Geoeconomics Center. Mondrita, thanks for being here. What was our big number this week?
So our big number this week, Josh, was 29%. That's how much trade between South Korea and Africa has grown in just the last year.
Okay, let's take a look at how that seems.
Right.
All right.
So what I want to point out first is that we're looking at an index with a base year of 2015. It's pretty clear just looking at it that South Korea has rapidly developed its trade with Africa, more so than other countries that we hear more about, maybe China, Japan, or even the US.
Yeah, we hear so much about China's investments in Africa, even, of course, here from a U.S. perspective, U.S. investments in Africa. I haven't heard nearly as much about South Korea's investments, but it jumps off the chart.
Absolutely. It is worth noting that South Korea is still not such a big player. Their total trade with Africa this year was about 20 billion, which is only a fraction of its trade with China. But they're definitely ramping up the scale.
Because here we're talking about pace of growth, not the total amount. So
Exactly.
China, of course, as you said, far and away the biggest player, but significant to note what's happening with South Korea. Are there specific projects that you saw in your research?
The thing that Philip and I sort of took as a starting point was that just last week, 8 African nations signed MOUs with the South Korean government for the K Rice Belt Initiative,
What's that?
where South Korea is going to help these African nations develop their rice production self-sufficiency by providing them with training, raw materials, smart farming technology, and this isn't something that South Korea has really done in the past, but it fits into President Yoon's agenda of making South Korea a real global pivotal state.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting to me. What's motivating South Korea? And it's really a foreign policy shift from the South Korean government. So what about China here? We talked a little, we think about China's investments in Africa. What does looking at the data tell you about China's trend long term?
So like I said, China is still by far the major trading partner for Africa. But just anecdotally, the China-Africa Trade Expo that took place at the end of last month had trade deals half the value of the expo from the previous year.
Significant.
So they may not be maybe pulling away from Africa, but definitely slowing the pace of development of relations with them. But it's clear that there are other Asian nations willing to step into that space now.
I think that's the big takeaway from this by the numbers. You know, whatever happens with China, hard to say at this point. Other Asian nations are becoming much more involved, and South Korea is one, which I think may have been under the radar. So Mandrita, thanks for looking into it for us, and we'll continue to track it here at the Center. Thanks so much for watching Guide to the Global Economy. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Make sure to hit like and subscribe to this channel. Look forward to seeing you in the future edition of Guide to the Global Economy.